Welcome back to That's Life with John Carver. Today I'm standing in Petra. He's like, where is Petra, John? Petra is in southern Jordan. So if you look this way, if you were able to get around here, you can see a whole bunch of ruins and structures to that side. And if you look that way around the corner here, you'll be able to see a lot more also. So the title of this show is really about building things and having tenacity to build things. But I'm taking the material for today's show from an author that I really enjoy reading. His name is Orison Swett Marden. And he wrote a book, he published a book back in about 1909 called Do It to a Finish. And I want to share parts of his book with you today because there is some information in this book that if you and I master it, we're going to be able to accomplish some great things in our life. And I'm using Petra as an example because if people would have started building this structure and stopped, we would not be able to see it here today. So again, the book is called Do It to a Finish by Orison Swett Marden. Now, Orison Swett Marden, his teacher, one of his instructors was a guy named Samuel Smiles. Samuel Smiles had a long history of education and mentoring other people. And I liken to think about that sometimes, how oftentimes you and I fail to realize the impact that we have on people in our lives, to understand that if they would not have paid the price to learn what they need to learn, then obviously we wouldn't be able to learn what we could learn. So let's jump into his book. He said, years ago, a relief lifeboat at New London sprung a leak. And while being repaired, a hammer was found at the bottom that had been left there by the builders 13 years before. From the constant motion of the boat, the hammer had worn through the planking clear down to the plating. Not long since, it was discovered that a girl had served 20 years for a 20-month sentence in an Alabama prison because the mistake of a court clerk who wrote years instead of months in the record of the prisoner's sentence. Years instead of months. The history of the human race is full of the most horrible tragedies caused by carelessness and the inexcusable blunders of those who never formed a habit of accuracy and thoroughness and doing things to a finish, just like you see behind me. Multitudes of people are hobbling around on one leg, having lost one arm or an eye or other maimed individuals because dishonest workmen wrought deception into the articles they manufactured, slighted in their work, and covered up defects and weak places with paint and varnish. In other words, my translation of what he just said is people do things halfway and then people get hurt. He goes back. He goes, how many have lost their lives because of dishonest work and carelessness and criminal blundering in railroad construction? Think of the tragedies caused by lies packed with car wheels and locomotives and steamboat boilers and engines. Remember, this was written 100 plus years ago. Lies and defective rails or ties or switches. Lies and dishonest labor put into manufactured material by workmen who said it was good enough for the meager workmen. Because people were not conscientious in their work, there were flaws in the steel, in the locomotive or other machinery that broke. The steel shaft broke in mid-ocean, and the lives of 1,000 passengers were jeopardized because of somebody's carelessness. Let me pause. How many times haven't you been hurt or gone through some difficulties in your life because of the carelessness of other people? Folks that didn't do things correctly and didn't do things to a finish in order for things to be done properly. He goes back. He goes, how many serious accidents have occurred because of the lack of care in the casting of steel girders and all sorts of iron building material? Even before they're completed, buildings often fall and bury the workmen under their ruins. Listen, because somebody was dishonest, either the employer or the employee, and worked lies and deceptions into the building. I think you and I can see that also in relationships that we have. Some of the relationships are not so honest, and the results show in a very short amount of time. He goes on. A big mill in a manufacturing city in Massachusetts fell one day while in full operation. The ruins accidentally took fire, and 125 lives were sacrificed. The disaster was the result of the grossest carelessness of the superintendent or master builder. Iron columns were put in that were defective in casting. They were thin as paper on one side and as thick as a plank on the other, when they should have been true to the hairline all around. When the pressure came upon them, listen, when the pressure came upon them, they were quickly broken, and botched work claimed its fearful holocaust of human lives. Some time ago, the world was startled by the collapse of a great bridge in Canada, which caused the lives of precious people and millions of dollars in property. On August 29th, we're talking probably 1907, said the newspaper reports of the disaster, 20,000 tons of steel, which had, in the course of several years, been laboriously worked into the south arm of the great bridge over the St. Lawrence River in Quebec, suddenly crumbled like a bunch of cardboard and fell into the river. Of these, over 70 were crushed to death or even drowned. Besides this terrible loss of life, the disaster must have cost the builders of the bridge millions of dollars, all wiped out of existence in a few seconds. Let me pause. I go back to Petra, this beautiful structure behind me, built about 300 BC, and it's still standing because of the quality of the workmen that invested their time and talent and treasure into this magnificent structure. Again, it goes on that way, it goes on that way. You got to check it out if you can ever fly over here to Jordan. So the book goes on, Do It to a Finish by Orison Swett Marden. He says the majority of railroad wrecks, of disasters of land and sea, which cause so much misery and cost so many lives, are the result of carelessness and thoughtlessness, or half-done, botched, blundering work. They're all evil fruits of the low ideals of careless, insufficient workers. I know, let me pause. How many times haven't you gone to a fast food place and the attitudes there are just horrible? I mean, they literally are horrible because they could care less whether or not you got what you want when you wanted it. He goes on. Everywhere over this broad earth, we see the tragic results of botched work. Wooden legs, armless sleeves, numberless graves, fatherless and motherless homes everywhere speak of somebody's carelessness, somebody's blunder, somebody's habit of inaccuracy. The worst crimes are not punishable by law. Carelessness, slipshoddness, lack of thoroughness are crimes against itself, against humanity, that often do more harm than the crimes that make the perpetrator an outcast from society. Where a tiny flaw or the slightest defect, he says, cost a precious life, carelessness is as much a crime as a deliberate criminal. If everybody put his consciousness into work, did it to a complete finish, it could only reduce the loss of human life, it says, the mangling and maiming of men and women to a fraction of what it is at present. But it would also give us a higher quality of manhood and womanhood. Excellence is so rare to find in society. Even today, 100 and some years later, excellence is really hard to find. He says, it takes honest work to make an honest character. Honest work to make an honest character. The habit of doing poor work, while after a while makes the worker dishonest in other things. The man who habitually slights his work slights his character. Interesting. Botched work makes a botched life. Our work is a part of us. Every botched job you let through your hands diminishes your competence, your efficiency, your ability to do good work, he says. So he ends this little chapter. Every inferior piece of work you do is an enemy which pulls you down and keeps you from getting on. Now, you might think, John, why are you reading a book that's over 100 years old? The concepts, as you hear in this book, are as true today as they were 100 and plus years ago. Because the majority, I would say over 80% of the public, do things halfway. They don't do things completely accurately, and then the results show accordingly because it's done halfway. They do things in a mediocre way, and then they expect the excellent results when they do things halfway. The older I get, I realize that it's really important for you and I to do things with excellence in everything that we do. So in chapter 2 of this book, Do It to a Finish by Orison Swett Marden, again, it was published back in 1909. I have a hard copy of that book from 1909. The second chapter in the book says the relation of work to character. Again, the relationship of work to character. He says, nothing kills ambition or lowers the life standard quicker than familiarity with the inferiority, that which is cheap. The cheap, he calls it, I'm embarrassed to say, he calls it the cheap John method of doing things. He goes on. He says, we unconsciously become like that with which we are habitually associated. It becomes part of us, and the habit of doing things in an inferior, slovenly way weaves its fatal defects into the very texture of the character and becomes part of a life web. Again, that's a very fancy way of saying things, but you and I have a tendency sometimes, not all of us, but maybe a few of us, have a tendency of doing things halfway. And when we do things halfway, then consistently over and over, the results fall on other people, like he shared in chapter 1. When you don't do things completely, other people pay the price. Imagine if the people behind me who built Petra would have done things incorrectly. This would not have stood a couple thousand years, and people would have been hurt when this building collapsed. So doing things the right way all the time do matter, sometimes for thousands of years. He goes on in chapter 2. Most young people think too much of quantity and too little of quality in their work. They try to do too much and do not do it well. They try to do too much and they don't do it well at all, he says. They do not realize that the education, the comfort, the satisfaction, the general improvement of bracing up the whole man that comes from doing one thing absolutely right, from putting listen, I like this, by putting the trademark of one's character on it, far outweighs the value that attaches to doing of 1,000 botched or slipshod jobs, he says. So let me translate into that into my language. It's better to do fewer things with excellence than a lot of things in a mediocre way. Again, it's better to do a few things with excellence instead of a lot of things halfway. He goes on in this same chapter. We are constituted that the quality which we put into our life work affects everything else in our lives and tends to bring our whole conduct to the same level, he says. The entire person takes on the characteristics of one's usual way of doing things. The habit of precision and accuracy strengthens the mentality and improves the whole character. He's just so fluid with his words, I think. He says, every half-done job that goes out of your hands leaves its trace, of demoralization behind and takes a bit from your self-respect. After slighting your work, he says, after doing a poor job, you are not quite the same person you were before. You are not likely to try to keep up with the quality of your work, not so likely to regard your word as sacred as before. You incapacitate yourself for doing your very best in proportion to the number of times you allow yourself to do the inferior. Again, he's saying to do it right the first time. Why not do it right the first time? Because then you don't have to do it over again. And then, like I've said now several times, like he said several times, people eventually will get hurt when you choose not to do things the right way. He goes on page 9 of this wonderful book. He says, I know a man who was extremely ambitious to do something very distinctive and who had the ability to do it. When he started on his career, he was very exact and painstaking. He demanded the best of himself and would not accept the second best in anything. The thought of slighting his work was painful to him, but his mental processes have been so deteriorated that he had become so demoralized by the habit, which after a while grew upon him, of accepting his second best. He says, and he wasn't even conscious of it. It is his day-to-day doing ordinary things without apparent, really any sort of humiliation at all, he says. And all of this he doesn't even know why he failed. Well, the reason is, if you think and read between the lines here, is because he did stuff halfway. You can't have excellence when you do stuff halfway. You look at any sports team out there. Every sports team that's won anything great strives for excellence in everything they do. He goes on. He says, one's ambition and ideals need constant watching and cultivation in order to keep the standards up. Many people are so constituted that their ambition wanes and their ideals drop when they are alone or careless or with indifferent people. Let me translate what he just said. The old saying is, birds of a feather flock together. When you and I hang around mediocre people, that is, people who don't strive for excellence in everything that they do, that attitude rubs off on us consistently. Imagine if mediocre people built all this. There is no way this would still be standing. I'll say this multiple times today. Stuff that stands, stuff that lasts centuries, is done by quality people. Orison Swett Marden is known by some very wealthy people in the world. They read his stuff. He goes on. Because he goes, one's ambition and ideals need constant watching and cultivation in order to keep the standards up. You and I have to maintain excellence. He goes on. He says, I recall a once prominent man who, until the death of his wife, had a very high ideal and a lofty aim. A man who was extremely painstaking and careful in everything he did, who would never accept anything from himself but the best he was capable of, but who, when he lived alone, listen, gradually dropped his lofty standards, neglected his appearance, and grew so slow in his personal habits that he became really repulsive, he said. And yet he was apparently absolutely unconscious of this, his words, insidious change. How quickly a youth of high ideals, who has been well trained in thoroughness, often deteriorates when he leaves home or goes to work for an employer with inferior ideals and slow methods. Again, you and I, our habits are going to change as a result of the people in our lives that you and I choose to hang around. He goes, the introduction of inferiority into our work is like introducing, listen, these are his words, strong words, even 100 years later, subtle poison into our system. Let me read that sentence again. The introduction of inferiority into our work is like introducing subtle poison into our system. It paralyzes, he says, the normal functions. Inferiority is an infection which, like leaven, affects the entire system. It dulls ideals, palsies the aspiring faculty, and again he goes on to say how it makes us mediocre when we consistently do stuff halfway. The human mechanism, he says, is so constituted that whatever goes wrong in one part, affects the whole structure. There is a very intimate relation between the quality of the work, and the quality of the character. Do you ever notice the rapid decline in a young man's character when he began to slight his work, to shirk, to slip in the rotten hours of rotten service? How many kids do you remember going to school with that would do things halfway or not do anything at all, and then you fast forward and see what they are today, and the results are staggering, that their results are mediocre at best. He goes on, if you should ask the inmates of our prisons what had caused their ruin, listen, many of them could trace the first signs of their deterioration to shirking, to clipping their hours, deceiving their employers, to indifferent, dishonest work. Today I'm talking about excellence. I'm talking about doing things right, completely right, the first time. He says, again on page 11 now, we are made to be honest. We're made to be honest. Honesty is our normal expression. And any departure from it demoralizes and taints our whole character. Listen, honesty means integrity in everything. It not only means reliability in our word, but also carefulness and accuracy and honesty in our work. It not only means reliability in our word, but also carefulness, accuracy, and honesty. It does not mean that if you only will not lie with your lips, you might lie and defraud the quality of your work. Listen, honesty, he says, means wholeness. Honesty means wholeness, completeness. It means truth in everything, in deed and in word. Merely not to steal another's money or goods is not all there is to honesty. You must not steal another's time. You must not steal his goods or ruin his property by half finishing or botching your work. He says, your contract with, listen to this. This is heavy for most of us. Your contract with your employer means that you will give him your best and not your second best. Think about that a minute. How many times haven't you and I been at work and we've been tired and we come up with all these excuses why we couldn't do a great job that day? When we're paid to do a good job, we're paid to do a great job, an excellent job every single day. Page 12 of the great book, Do It to a Finish. Aside from the question of honesty, of its effect on yourself, you can't afford to give the dregs of yourself and your efforts to the man who hires you to do your best, for it will bring the dregs, his word, back to you. What a fool you are, said one workman to another, to take so much pains with that job when you don't get much pay for it. He says, get the most money for the least work is my rule, and I get twice as much money as you do, he says. That may be, replied the other, but I shall like myself better. I shall think more of myself, and that is more important to me than money. You will like yourself better when you have the approval of your conscience that will be worth more to you than any amount of money you can pocket through fraudulent, skimped, or botched work. Nothing else can give you the glow, listen, nothing else can give you the glow of satisfaction, the electric thrill or uplift which comes from a superbly done job. Perfect work, listen, perfect work harmonizes with the very principles of our being because we were made for perfection. It fits our very natures. Do you know how many people do things halfway most days? Do you know how many people don't do things completely correctly every single day? I'm asking you today to be the exception to the rule. I'm asking you to be in the top 10% of doing things correctly. Page 13, we're soon to run out of time. He says, someone has said it is a race between negligence and ignorance as to which can make more trouble. Many a young man is being kept down by probably seems a small thing to him. Negligence or lack of accuracy. He never quite finishes anything he undertakes. He cannot be depended upon to do anything quite right. His work always needs to be looked over by someone else. Hundreds of clerks and bookkeepers are getting small salaries in poor positions today because they have never learned to do things absolutely right. Again, the show today, the theme today, is doing things perfectly so they last forever. Because if not, then somebody else is going to have to come behind you and fix your mediocre work. Prominent businessman, the story says, that had carelessness and he was not very accurate. It cost, at least back in 1909, it cost one city $1 million a day. The manager of a large Chicago house says that he has to station pickets here and there through the establishment in order, listen, to neutralize the evils of inaccuracy and blundering habit. One of John Wanamaker's partners says that unnecessary blunders and mistakes have cost him $25,000 a year. Now think about this a minute. This was in the early 1900s. It was costing him $25,000 a year. Imagine if that same business was today in today's dollars because of people doing things halfway. Many an employee, he says, would be shocked at the thought of telling his employer a lie with his lips and lying every day in the quality of his work, in his dishonest service, in the rotten hours that he's allowed to slip by, and shirking and indifference to his employer's interests. Think about this a second. I've been an employer for a number of years, and it's amazing to me how employees look at businesses different than employers. I get it, that they're not the owner of the business. But if employees look at their job as being an owner of the business, then A, they would maintain employment probably for a much longer period of time, but also they would be promoted a lot faster when they treat their boss's business as their own. He goes on. He says, yet on every side we see all sorts of selling for a song because the maker put no character and no thought into them. Buttons fly off and things just fall apart because people don't do things properly. Everywhere, he says, we see furniture which looks all right, but in reality it's full of blemishes and weaknesses and covered up with paint and varnish. Glue starts at joints and chairs and bed seams break down because everything goes to pieces because it wasn't built properly the first time. I don't know if you think about this or not, but you and I are building our lives 1 hour at a time. So why would you do things halfway when you have to go back and waste the time that you can't get back again? You literally can't get your time back again. I wish we could, but it doesn't work that way. He goes, I have known a buggy to collapse completely before it had been used 3 months. The varnish and paint peeled off and revealed spongy spokes and knotted wood, open joints, and all sorts of horrible looking work. Maybe to sell, not for service, would be a good label. He says it was half made and dishonest and botched, and it was just disgusting. He says, in other words, he said, quote, don't buy me, you poor laboring people. I was made only to sell, not for service. So again, I'm going to end the show here today with just a couple final thoughts. A, I would suggest that you go on Google and find more information about Orison Swett Marden. His material, even though it was written over 100 years ago, is still very applicable here today because his theories and his understanding of human behavior is still very accurate. So I'm asking you today not to do things halfway. I'm asking you to do things with excellence. Everything you do, whether it's washing the dishes or cleaning your room or cleaning the house or especially at work, do it completely right, and you're going to find that people are drawn to you, and you're going to be rewarded for the excellence that you achieve in your life. My name is John Carver, and I hope this information helped you today. Thanks so much.